In 1951, Harlem, armed enforcers stood alongside a treacherous brother. They controlled the firearms and the overwhelming manpower. Yet within 10 chaotic seconds, 3 bodies hit the pavement. That gunfire permanently stripped the Italian syndicate of their neighborhood. To comprehend how a single treachery reshaped the underworld, one must trace the absolute origin. The city air reeked of impending disaster. This was absolutely not the standard criminal element. It transcended the stale liquor pooling outside taverns or the thick tobacco choking illicit alleyway gambles. The atmosphere carried an ancient and suffocating dread. It presented as an invisible toxin burrowing deep into human lungs past daybreak. The calendar read late October 1951. The freezing temperature refused to simply nip exposed skin, but ruthlessly crushed your windpipe instead. Plumes of exhaust billowed from subterranean vents on 116th Street, spiraling upward like abandoning spirits. A profound silence blanketed the district, emitting that eerie stillness which only surfaced when terrible acts were unfolding and streetwise locals had firmly deadbolted their residences against encroaching violence. The notorious kingpin positioned himself before the glass panes of his Edgecombe Avenue sanctuary, observing the desolate concrete below. For 48 hours straight, slumber evaded him entirely. A man of his caliber categorically rejected fear. His severe exhaustion stemmed purely from relentless strategic calculation. Whenever his sharp mind locked onto problems, rest became impossible. The ominous communication materialized exactly 3 evenings prior. It arrived as a naked parchment shoved quietly beneath his illicit Lenox Avenue lottery threshold. The document contained 4 chilling words declaring a nighttime meeting alongside a location. An identifying mark was completely absent. Every soul above Central Park fully recognized the mafia faction aggressively testing the boundaries of his hard-earned empire. The notorious Genovese crime syndicate spent 2 full years stalking his perimeter. They dispatched slick intermediaries hiding brutal ambitions behind polite whispers, systematically probing defenses like feral wolves. Now they demanded a direct summit. The seasoned boss absorbed the written threat twice, creased it once, and incinerated the evidence. Afterward, he snatched the telephone. He demanded his subordinates fetch Rico without delay. Certain historical fragments derive from archived judicial transcripts, meaning the factual reality of that bloody twilight remains buried. Rico Alvarez operated as a human phantom separating rival factions. He possessed mixed Caribbean blood and zero trustworthiness. Miraculously, he maintained the fragile confidence of powerful enemies, requiring a diplomatic channel for avoiding total warfare. His resume included managing lucrative Eastern intersections for the mafia while simultaneously running illegal Western lotteries. He draped these conflicting allegiances like tailored garments, blending into both dangerous circles while remaining utterly disloyal. By the time the erratic middleman arrived 40 minutes later, nervous perspiration drenched his freezing skin. The kingpin stated the rivals approached him as an absolute certainty. The associate ignorantly claimed a seat, an error strategically ignored. Henry, the sweating informant confessed Carmine made contact. This minor affiliate operated a bloody meat market on Pleasant Avenue and explicitly desired to negotiate geographical boundaries. The opposition supposedly wished to divide neighborhood profits peacefully. The stoic boss subjected him to a prolonged stare. It was an intensely piercing gaze, capable of breaking men. The terrified intermediary claimed he merely promised delivery. The informant claimed no further involvement. The kingpin echoed those words, approaching the glass once again. Down on the frozen pavement, a frantic mother violently dragged her offspring along. Local residents possessed supernatural instincts for detecting danger. Citizens surviving this brutal environment always sought shelter before violence erupted. Breaking the silence, the boss commanded a negotiation arrangement. He ordered the messenger to relay his willingness. The terrified informant released a foolishly massive sigh. However, the crime lord abruptly halted him, keeping dead eyes fixed squarely outside. He delivered a chilling warning demanding absolute secrecy. The boss revealed his absolute awareness of the dual allegiances. He explained this betrayal was tolerated because basic survival required income. Yet he firmly promised that if any unauthorized secrets crossed enemy lines before the summit, the treason would be instantly detected. Such an infraction would necessitate an incredibly gruesome confrontation. The panicked informant bobbed his head in desperate obedience. The sweating rats sputtered frantic agreements before bolting. Afterward, the calculating kingpin executed 3 brutally brief telephone directives. By midnight, lethal enforcers secured every conceivable escape route surrounding the designated negotiation hall on East 116th. Officially owned by an innocent postman, the establishment functioned under ruthless predators, whose monikers remained unspoken in polite society. A pair of heavily armed loyalists had already successfully infiltrated the premises 60 minutes prior to the rendezvous. One operative blended behind the counter, while another lurked near the cooking area. A getaway chauffeur idled nearby, and a phantom watched the informant residence. These extreme preparations were certainly not implemented to ignite a neighborhood bloodbath. This legendary boss survived 23 brutal years by memorizing one inescapable law. He absolutely knew peaceful enemy summons were always disguised executions. Whenever an entrance unlocks on your behalf, a silent architect has already orchestrated the reality waiting beyond the threshold. True power always boils down to one terrifying inquiry regarding who commands the avenues of escape. Fastening his overcoat and glancing at his timepiece, the infamous boss permitted his mind a fleeting calculation regarding their true desires. Whispers suggested they demanded 30% of his illicit lottery, representing a guaranteed monthly tribute from the shadow economy. The audacity nearly provoked a grin as these outsiders approached a brutal education concerning this invincible territory that neither wealth nor brute force could buy. These blood-stained streets absolutely refused capitulation. The community simply swallowed aggression, only to retaliate with a devastating force born from shadows. Emerging into the freezing urban chill, the kingpin walked alone for 4 seconds before 2 silent phantoms materialized from the darkness to flank his steps without speaking. Casting a glance backward was a permanently abandoned luxury. That infamous gathering spot on East 116th stood unmarked, a deliberate omission since its true clientele required no formal introduction whatsoever. Ignorance served as a protective shield for the uninvited, establishing a silent survival code governing such clandestine establishments. Absolute authority broadcasted through deliberate voids, as the legend materialized exactly at 11:47. Arriving 13 minutes early was a calculated maneuver designed to harvest critical intelligence from an unoccupied environment. Early arrival permits thorough analysis of seating architecture, a tally of escape routes, and assessing strategically engineered shadows. Crossing the threshold with dual enforcers trailing, a sudden atmospheric distortion warned him that an invisible trap existed. This danger lacked the clarity of discharged artillery, manifesting instead as a creeping tension identical to heavy ozone before storms. Only an experienced mind could decode this danger, registering an unacceptable density of bodies within. Their pact stipulated exactly 4 representatives per faction, ensuring adequate testimony without triggering a hostile military escalation. Such parameters served as foundational law for underworld diplomacy. These unwritten doctrines governed elite criminals, yet the kingpin tallied 12 enemy soldiers before even breaching the floor plan's midway point. The count was 12, prompting him to halt his advance as his twin shadows froze simultaneously. Silence reigned without gestures exchanged. 15 years of shared bloodshed forged an intuitive, kinetic telepathy bypassing conscious communication entirely. Anchoring the far wall behind an untouched vintage sat a notoriously recognizable figure the Harlem boss had never personally engaged. This was Carmine Falcone, an ambitious mid-level commander hungering for supreme power, infamous for escalating violent conflicts long after rational minds would have surrendered entirely. Hovering around 55, the man possessed brutally thick knuckles. His physical composure projected a terrifying calm, easily misinterpreted as endurance, but recognized as lethal readiness by survivors. The hostile commander offered a grin, completely saturated with the premature arrogance of absolute victory. Projecting his greeting across the tense expanse, the mobster welcomed his guest, plunging the narrative into a confrontation heavily documented throughout the neighborhood's bloody folklore. The overarching historical framework remains remarkably consistent. Conversational elements are reimagined to capture the terrifying essence, ending with 3 agonizing seconds of absolute silence from the kingpin. His cold gaze swept over 12 enforcers, analyzed the timber surface, and finally locked onto vacant seats, deliberately sawed down to rest below the enemy's eye level. Such microscopic psychological tactics would easily bypass the awareness of ordinary street thugs. Processing this disrespect instantly, the veteran approached the setup, dragged a seat backward, pivoted it exactly 45 degrees away from his adversary, and claimed his territory. This effortless physical maneuver transmitted a deafening declaration of dominance. The unspoken message radiated contempt, establishing that negotiations would strictly follow his personal doctrine or cease to exist completely. Refusing to acknowledge the secondary seat while his lieutenant maintained vigil, this psychological shift caused the leader's smirk to fracture. Tension rippled through the hostiles as resting fingers twitched slowly toward concealed steel. Meanwhile, an undercover ally behind the counter robotically wiped a tumbler, perfectly mirroring the dead quiet of an assassin near the culinary entrance. Informing the rival about the breached head count, the boss kept his vocal tone hollow, presenting a chilling factual statement. Displaying emotion signals vulnerability, prompting the hostile to dismiss the breach as a necessary security measure during volatile times. Repeating the phrase about defensive measures, he lowered his chin rhythmically, projecting an illusion of deep philosophical contemplation. His counterargument implied an aggressive play, plunging the room into suffocating silence. Outside, an automobile cruised down 116th, casting a spectral beam through the obscured glass above the bar. That momentary flash painted the distant plaster, revealing a terrifying truth as the mastermind silently tallied 4 additional assassins melting into the background shadows. 16 operatives stood guard. 2 enforcers lingered indoors, while another pair watched the main doorway. Single guards watched both back doors. A getaway wheelman idled 2 streets east. He factored in followers entering behind him, but deemed that risk absolute zero after thoroughly securing his trail beforehand. The bleak arithmetic of the enclosed space offered him no advantage. He requested plain water from the bartender, pausing until the drink appeared before breaking the deadly silence. Staring at the solitary glass placed before him, he finally commanded his rival to deliver the intended message. Falcone shifted forward. The murky illumination caught the harsh lines of his weathered face, carving out grim, ancient shadows. Deliberately lacing his fingers atop the wood, he executed a calculated display of utter composure before declaring them both men of commerce. He insisted that Harlem was merely an economic zone requiring structured governance to function flawlessly. Utter chaos reigns. Unchecked rivalries flourish, and such fierce friction creates waste. They gathered solely to discuss eradicating those losses. Bumpy deliberately tasted his drink before asserting his strict operational discipline. Falcone mocked that isolated control, demanding supreme authority over the entire territory. The vastness of that claim crashed into the silence like a dropped anvil. Bumpy firmly grounded his glass. He fixed a dead, weary stare upon his adversary. Decades of underworld rivals had learned to dread that vacant, analyzing look far more than any explosive rage. Yelling signaled raw emotion. That chilling stare meant deadly calculation. He ordered him to proceed. Falcone resumed his pitch as 12 to 16 enforcers maintained their rigid stations. The ambient chill within the Eastern social clubs steadily deepened. 116th Street cooled 2 degrees as night progressed, and still nobody moved. The number 30 smashed the table like a hurled brick shattering a window. They demanded 30% of all illicit lotteries and daily street levies that funded his massive network spanning Harlem from 110th Street directly toward the bridge. These guaranteed monthly tributes would funnel through Rico as the intermediary. That specific betrayal revealed precisely how long this hostile takeover had been secretly plotting in the shadows. Falcone delivered the ultimatum with the cold certainty of an unavoidable truth. This was no gentle negotiation, but rather a brutal redrawing of territorial borders. He effectively dictated the new boundary lines. He outlined the complete redistribution of power as an absolute finality. The conquerors were merely delivering a courtesy notification. Bumpy softly repeated 30%. Falcone promised a seamless transition, swearing no daily operations or soldiers would face hostile interference. The invaders vowed to respect his internal hierarchy. Harlem would remain under his direct command, provided the new partners quietly siphoned their share of the profits. Bumpy echoed the euphemism. The surrounding silence grew so absolute that a distant radiator ticked with the erratic, metallic rhythm of a totally broken timepiece. He distinctly registered the steady respirations of the guard hovering mere inches from his own back. That particular soldier had anchored himself there since the meeting commenced. The menacing proximity allowed the thug's body heat to seep through the tailored fabric of Bumpy's coat. He had tracked the enforcer's looming presence during the very first 30 seconds. He deliberately maintained his seated position. Bumpy studied the scarred mahogany stretching between him and his rival. The battered surface bore watermark rings from countless deadly parleys occurring over several ruthless decades. Powerful crime lords utilized these meetings to confront rivals. They negotiated heavily armed truces to decide which overlord's brutal vision of the future would ultimately survive the bloody night. He deliberately pressed both bare palms flat against the varnished timber. He offered no clenched fists or aggressive tells, just open fingers decoding the wooden grain. He delivered a solitary word of refusal without offering a single shred of explanation. No counter-proposals emerged. He made zero effort to haggle over the extortion rate or suggest peaceful detours. That single, devastating syllable plummeted into the center, followed by a suffocating stillness. Academic experts and mob historians emphasized that outright defiance during such heavy gangland sit-downs remained virtually non-existent. Everyone present completely grasped the lethal consequences. The rival boss kept his facial features perfectly rigid. A chilling transformation occurred beneath his skin. His gaze hollowed out, signaling a predator's brain, violently shifting from peaceful diplomacy straight toward calculated murder. Falcone advised him to reconsider that suicidal response. Bumpy coldly confirmed his absolute certainty. Contemplate this further. My answer remains absolute. Across the room stood a juvenile 19-year-old hitman, whom Bumpy had profiled within 40 seconds of arriving. The suspected 20-year-old nervously guarded the western wall. The inexperienced punk possessed anxious hands, lacking the discipline of veteran killers. His dominant fingers twitched a mere 2 or 3 inches toward his concealed holster. Bumpy caught the subtle twitch, matching his loyalist by the pantry and the silent bartender. Nobody uttered a warning as Falcone fractionally elevated his open palm. He avoided theatrical motions, simply raising 2 fingers off the timber. Instantly, the sweating rookie froze his lethal reach. The atmosphere inside the room grew suffocatingly heavy. You are making a dangerous statement, Falcone observed. His tone shifted, remaining measured but completely stripped of any lingering warmth. Beneath that calm facade lurked a brutal, unvarnished truth. I admire bold declarations. Yet every aggressive posture carries a grave penalty. You comprehend the gravity of my words perfectly well. I grasp your implication entirely, Bumpy replied with chilling calm. Then you must realize this negotiation possesses only 2 possible outcomes. Almost all negotiations hold that potential, Bumpy countered softly. The real mystery lies in how far the man sitting opposite is truly willing to proceed. A suffocating quiet descended, carrying an almost tangible, crushing mass. This profound stillness seemed to press violently against the confined walls, Shadows deepened around the perimeter, where the rival enforcers stood as silent sentinels. The tension hovered between the two bosses, manifesting like a living, breathing entity. Falcone scrutinized his opponent with cold, predatory calculation. Bumpy absorbed the scrutiny with unreadable stillness, his hands remaining perfectly motionless on the wood. Somewhere beyond those walls echoed a faint noise, perhaps heavy metal creaking, or the decaying structure protesting the bitter chill. It was a minute disturbance, easily dismissed as entirely irrelevant background noise. Yet, its distinct cadence carried profound implications for any vigilant survivor trapped inside that deadly space. Bumpy never shifted his gaze, though his predatory mind instantly cataloged the audio cue. "You are allowed to leave this place unharmed," Falcone ultimately declared. "You will contemplate the grim reality of losing 30% versus the absolute destruction that follows otherwise. Within 48 hours, your final response will be delivered directly by Rico. Only the definitive truth will suffice." Bumpy deliberately scraped his wooden seat backward and rose to his feet. He methodically fastened the upper closure of his tailored suit. Smoothing his sleeves with precision, he offered a parting glance so complex that it would haunt his rival for the ensuing 6 hours. This chilling stare lacked simple categorization, bridging the uneasy gap between subtle mockery and absolute psychological indifference. Terror was completely absent from his demeanor. Instead, his eyes revealed a mastermind who had orchestrated the bloody conclusion long before ever stepping across that fatal threshold. "Your resolution will arrive within 48 hours, the crime boss promised softly. Pivoting with deliberate grace, he began his measured march toward the shadowy exit. In his wake, the entire syndicate hideout seemed to suspend its respiration in a state of collective dread. Stationed along the western perimeter, a nervous rookie shifted his grip, sliding his weapon hand 3 inches further down. The resulting mechanical snap was frighteningly subtle. The distinct metallic scrape of a revolver preparing to fire was instantly smothered as a veteran enforcer crushed the boy's wrist, draining all blood from his knuckles. That lethal metallic whisper reached his ears clearly. Yet, his rhythmic, confident pace never faltered for even a fraction of a second. Slipping past his loyal sentries, he melted into the freezing Harlem evening, dissolving completely into the desolate, pitch-black urban avenue. The reinforced timber of the clandestine gathering place slammed shut at his back, echoing with an absolute, undeniable sense of finality. The devastating secret hidden from the mob boss was that the promised 48-hour ultimatum had been methodically initiated long before the sit-down ever commenced. Lethal countermeasures were currently unfolding across 3 distinct intersections and 2 sprawling boroughs, utilizing shadow networks completely invisible to their mutual intermediary. This summit was fundamentally devoid of any real compromise. Its sole purpose was gifting his adversary 48 hours of fatal arrogance, while deep inside that illicit venue on East 116th Street, the trembling junior gunman collapsed heavily onto a wooden seat, his terrified gaze remaining locked permanently onto the barricaded exit. His mind scrambled to comprehend how a solitary figure could dismiss an arsenal of weaponry without showing the slightest trace of a man who had authored his own doom. Instead, he exuded the aura of a Grand Master executing a checkmate. Surprisingly, the initial burst of fatal violence did not originate from the rival faction. The lethal strike was delivered directly into his unguarded back. Only 3 paces separated him from freedom, his attire immaculate and his tactical brain already orchestrating the forthcoming 48 hours, when a sharp blast splintered the quiet like a snapping femur. It lacked the deafening roar of heavy artillery, presenting instead as a compact, terrifyingly intimate metallic pop. It was the muffled discharge of a close-quarters assassination designed to evade public notice. The atmospheric pressure shifted violently against his skin before his brain registered the catastrophe. To his immediate flank fell Marcus, a 26-year-old loyalist who had spent 7 dedicated years bleeding for the organization. This was the same desperate youth rescued from a destitute street corner back in 1944 and molded into a deeply respected operative. The young enforcer was already crumpled lifelessly on the linoleum, a fatal entry wound burrowed behind his left ear from under 4 feet away. Pivoting sharply, the boss realized the executioner was Eddie Rawls. This was the exact same Eddie who had anchored his inner circle for 11 solid years. The very same driver who had rushed him through traffic the night his infant girl took her first breath. The man possessed the blueprints to their entire survival system, memorizing countless escape paths and secret clandestine fortresses. He held the true identity of every operative, entrusted with the syndicate's deepest vulnerabilities over 11 agonizing years of shared bloodshed and unshakable brotherhood. Yet here stood that beloved confidant, frozen a mere 6 feet away, gripping a smoking .38 caliber weapon, the steel barrel aimed squarely at the patriarch's heart, quivering violently in the shadows like a terrified, cornered animal. "Eddie," the Godfather whispered, his vocal cords entirely devoid of inflection. That isolated name carried zero trace of astonishment or the agonizing sting of absolute treason. 23 years surviving the ruthless streets of Harlem had taught him a brutal truth. Displaying your emotional wounds merely provides your assassin with another deadly blade. "Remain still," the traitor choked out. His pitch was completely shattered, echoing the despair of a soul who had simulated this exact murder 10,000 times, only to find the actual horror utterly unbearable. "Keep your hands visible and remain entirely motionless. Do not dare to shift your weight." A suffocating silence instantly consumed the space. 16 enforcers backing the Italian boss had represented the paramount danger present barely 30 moments prior. They now stood frozen against the perimeter, silently analyzing the shifting dynamic while awaiting their next directive. They witnessed an unforeseen scenario developing that caught them completely off guard, thereby providing the seasoned leader with a crucial revelation. This ambush was entirely unrelated to the Italian syndicate. The mafia leader appeared genuinely shocked by the turn of events, indicating that the traitor operated under a covert external alliance. He was clearly motivated by an unknown agenda rather than mafia funds. Another unseen entity was pulling the strings. The veteran gangster coldly demanded to know the exact price of his loyalty. He chillingly asked his former ally what specific sum had purchased his soul. Countless urban legends originating from that violent era circulated widely across the neighborhood networks of local grooming parlors and sacred congregations. Midnight gambling circles heavily debated bribes, stretching anywhere between $5,000 and $20,000. While the authentic sum remained a permanent mystery, the nervous turncoat noticeably clenched his facial muscles. Tears began welling in the traitorous man's eyes. He desperately attempted to claim that finances were not his primary motivation. The stoic leader immediately interrupted by stating that greed is always the fundamental catalyst. He noted that occasionally individuals are manipulated into believing cash symbolizes a deeper concept. Regardless of the philosophical justification, the root cause is always financial gain, prompting a final demand for the exact figure. The trembling man confessed to accepting $15,000, his voice decaying into a faint murmur. He stammered out accusations that their leader had allegedly planned to betray their syndicate, claiming a secret pact with the opposing family had already been finalized. The treacherous narrative suggested that their boss intended to pocket 30% of the profits while surrendering the neighborhood territory entirely. This fabricated rumor insisted the entire crew would be forced into servitude under the rival mobster before the winter thawed. The hardened kingpin stared intensely at his former friend in absolute silence. He then quietly questioned whether the betrayer had genuinely swallowed such an absurd fabrication. The traitor attempted to speak, but abruptly choked on his words. A profound flash of torment shadowed his features, revealing the devastating realization of an individual who finally comprehended the magnitude of the deception. He suddenly recognized that the elaborate fiction peddled to him was engineered specifically to manipulate him into committing this exact act of mutiny. The imposing boss locked his icy gaze onto his target. He coldly stated that a simple conversation could have prevented this tragedy, and then he shifted his posture laterally rather than advancing or retreating. One deliberate and sudden glide to his left side masterfully removed his physical form from the immediate trajectory of the hostile weapon. Simultaneously, his dominant arm emerged fluidly from the depths of his trench coat, his fingers already tightly wrapped around the cold steel handle of his concealed revolver. The panicked traitor squeezed the trigger. His erratic bullet missed its mark completely, tearing into the heavy timber threshold nearby and launching sharp fragments that slashed a blistering trail across the crime boss's face. The veteran enforcer did not retaliate with a solitary blast. He discharged his weapon 2 consecutive times with such chilling precision that the cadence felt entirely robotic, striking directly at the core of his target's chest. The mortally wounded man slammed backward into the plaster barricade, his body dragging downward in a sluggish descent. He collapsed like a punctured balloon, his deadly firearm bouncing noisily across the floorboards long before his lifeless frame finally settled onto the ground. This entire violent choreography of evasion and execution concluded in under 2 heartbeats. A brief and terrifying paralysis gripped every single person breathing inside that tense environment. Suddenly, the suspended animation shattered into absolute pandemonium. A rival soldier positioned against the eastern boundary immediately reached for his holstered pistol. An undercover ally stationed near the liquor cabinet vaulted across the counter, ruthlessly bringing the hostile guard to the ground before the enemy could even draw his firearm. The struggling pair violently impacted a nearby dining surface, obliterating the furniture under their combined mass and sending deadly shards of shattered tumblers flying across the concrete. An additional operative guarding the culinary entrance marched decisively into the fray, his barrel raised high to dominate the western flank through a flawless and tactical visual scan. Without a fraction of delay, the Italian boss violently propelled himself away from his seat, sending his heavy wooden stool crashing forcefully into the bodyguard stationed at his rear. This sudden chain reaction caused a pair of armed associates to collide clumsily within the confined perimeter near the back boundary. The neighborhood kingpin forcefully hoisted the dining surface standing between his body and the erupting madness. The barrier was a massive object, constructed from dense timber that had aged gracefully for 50 winters. He brutally propelled the antique furniture forward like a medieval siege weapon, plowing directly into the gathering of hitmen stationed opposite his location. The violent impact struck a pair of assailants squarely in their pelvises, violently slamming their bodies downward against the unforgiving pavement. A sickening cranial fracture echoed from one of the falling thugs, an awful noise that permanently eliminated his capacity to fight for the remainder of the night. The establishment transformed into a whirlwind of deafening shouts and erratic movements, while the pungent, suffocating stench of spent munitions rapidly polluted the atmosphere. A pair of additional blasts erupted from an undetermined location on the eastern flank. The veteran survivor found it impossible to identify the shooter or precisely pinpoint the lethal trajectory. He merely sensed a deadly projectile slicing the oxygen dangerously close to his temple. Despite the imminent threat, he was already charging relentlessly toward the rival commander. His target was not chosen due to any physical prowess possessed by the Italian boss, but rather because the man represented the ultimate operational beacon for his crew. The fate suffered by the mob boss over the approaching 30 moments would dictate if his surviving foot soldiers would choose violence or retreat. The seasoned strategist had calculated this psychological reality long before weaponizing the heavy furniture. Within any confined battlefield, a single commanding figure exists whose hierarchical rank dictates the corresponding actions of every other combatant present. A true tactician ignores the endless infantry and directly obliterates the enemy standard. The rival leader had scrambled upright and was retreating toward the distant barricade with a raised palm, though the absolute bedlam made it impossible to decipher if he was conceding defeat or ordering an execution. The relentless neighborhood kingpin devoured the intervening distance with merely 4 massive steps. He violently snatched the retreating mafioso by the collar of his luxurious outerwear, grabbing fistfuls of premium dark slate fabric. This exquisite garment demanded a price tag far exceeding what local households could ever afford for a monthly grocery budget. Its wearer was brutally slammed backward into the partition with enough sheer force to shatter the underlying foundation. Only 8 mere inches separated their tense expressions. The veteran gangster commanded his captive to heed his next words with absolute concentration. His vocal tone mirrored the identical deadpan delivery he had used addressing the traitor earlier. It remained eerily stabilized, projecting a chilling calmness that had not elevated a single fraction of heat, regardless of the extreme bloodshed occurring throughout the previous 90 heartbeats. He quietly threatened the boss to terminate the assault immediately, warning that failing to do so would result in the establishment experiencing an eternally terrifying silence. The mobster's stare hardened instantly. His previous artificial warmth vanished, replaced by the grim gaze of a predator calculating a sudden, massive loss. The boss bellowed an order to drop weapons, ensuring his voice carried. He demanded a total ceasefire. The frantic tempo dragged into a heavy crawl rather than silence. Within that sudden decay of absolute mayhem, a new variable immediately surfaced. The crime boss detected an approaching noise that completely shattered his current tactical reality. The shrieking wail of numerous police cruisers tore through the dark neighborhood, accelerating toward their exact location. Shoving the rival mobster aside, he scanned the shattered environment before eyeing the exit. A grim realization washed over him, confirming this brutal evening was far from its darkest hour. Thick haze actively mutates physical reality rather than simply blinding an area. It viciously crushes distance while entirely obliterating visual depth. Human forms rapidly deteriorate into nothing but vague, featureless shadows. Trapped inside a claustrophobic nightmare, choked with sulfur and shattered debris, combatants faced a terrifying psychological test. Every moving figure forced a frantic mental calculation to separate loyal friend from deadly foe. Cognitive processing degrades into pure survival instinct. An operative either aggressively advances or completely freezes. They pull the heavy trigger or fatally hesitate. Retreat and aggression present the only available choices. The reigning crime boss chose a relentless advance. He deliberately stepped into the most lethal, perilous zone of the entire battlefield. A pair of rival enforcers consolidated their position against the distant barricade, frantically raising their firearms. The tactical geometry proved utterly disastrous. A critical vulnerability completely exposed his left flank. Wrecked furniture entirely trapped his loyal kitchen operative. Meanwhile, the desperate mixologist remained pinned beneath the shattered counter, intensely struggling to survive a private nightmare. Advancing guaranteed severe peril. Yet, a relentless frontal push remained the sole path to definitive resolution. Slicing a direct path through the wreckage, he sprinted in a low crouch and squeezed off a single round at the closest target. The projectile shattered the enforcer's collarbone, violently whipping his body off balance. That non-lethal strike neutralized an immediate threat without delivering a fatal blow. The pragmatic leader refused to indulge in pure, emotional vengeance during this ongoing crisis. His intellect focused solely on absolute dominance and immediate survival. A brief, paralyzing doubt suddenly gripped the remaining shooter. It perfectly mirrored the profound shock of an operative watching their guaranteed strategy instantly collapse. Their adversary entirely defied logical prediction, completely shattering the established rules of combat engagement. A tiny fraction of a moment transforms into a vast eternity during violently dynamic tactical confrontations. The ruthless tactician devoured the separating gap, violently burying a devastating elbow strike beneath the target's chin, perfectly powered by relentless kinetic energy. The battered enforcer crumpled violently into the plaster, remaining utterly motionless. 2 threats eliminated, he pivoted sharply. The devastated landscape bore zero resemblance to the vibrant gathering spot it represented 12 minutes prior. Broken seats surrounded capsized dining tables. The massive liquor mirror lay entirely obliterated. The exact timing of that destruction eluded his memory. Deafening combat noise completely masked the crash. A solitary ceiling fixture continued blazing, casting harsh, sickly illumination. This intense glare transformed the drifting haze into a seemingly impenetrable, solid mass. His loyal associate remained crumpled near the entryway, The stoic leader locked away the traumatic image, burying the emotional weight deep inside a mental vault until survival was fully secured and grief became permissible. Another fallen operative rested heavily against the baseboard, completely devoid of any visible movement. The rival commander occupied the epicenter of the carnage, cautiously elevating his empty palms in temporary surrender. He scrutinized his opponent with a rapidly evolving gaze over the preceding 30 seconds, ultimately settling into an undeniable manifestation of profound, grudging criminal admiration. A trio of hostile enforcers maintained operational combat readiness, still gripping loaded firearms. The gunmen froze in a loose geometric formation across the debris. Utter paralysis gripped the squad as the unfolding disaster violently contradicted every single tactical scenario they had ever drilled for. Official police archives remain completely empty. Bureaucratic files from that evening intentionally omit the true headcount and exact timeline of violence. Surviving archival evidence remains profoundly shattered and deliberately scrubbed of damning truth. The Kingpin delivered a grim tactical summary. Oxygen raggedly entered his lungs, an involuntary response to extreme exertion rather than cowardice. Sprinting through wreckage and neutralizing a pair of targets within 10 heartbeats exacted a severe biological toll. A jagged wooden shard had deeply lacerated his cheekbone. A heated crimson trail crept down his profile, intensely felt but completely invisible. He spoke coldly. "A trio of your soldiers remains active. My pair holds the line. That bleeding enforcer requires immediate surgical attention, yet survival appears probable. As for my associate..." A swift visual sweep verified his operative's combat readiness. Those cowards who fled possess zero intention of returning before dawn. Therefore, this battleground hosts a perfectly balanced standoff, while an overwhelming police swarm rapidly approaches from dual avenues. The cornered mafioso marginally dropped his palms. His calculating brain furiously attempted to reconstruct a completely fresh operational paradigm. The observant boss witnessed this silent psychological shift, completely altering his enemy's gaze. Human features inevitably warp upon realizing a carefully crafted narrative of absolute dominance has violently shattered, immediately superseded by a vastly inferior tactical reality. "Your stated purpose involved peaceful diplomacy," the hardened leader elaborated. "I flatly rejected your proposal. Subsequently, an aggressive element attempted to forcefully override my denial by shooting my loyal soldier. That specific threat is permanently neutralized." He paused, letting the heavy silence fully marinate. We inevitably return to the core dilemma. Only now the relentless wail of sirens approaches a room echoing with a dark narrative no one dared to articulate. Falcone studied the ruined floor, examined the battered plaster, and finally locked cold eyes with Bumpy. He noted the approaching authorities, prompting Bumpy to grimly acknowledge that an unseen observer always summons the law. The true mystery remained their intended target. This heavy inquiry hung in the tense air, met with utter silence, as every man realized the complex truth would dictate the next 30 minutes of their existence. The world outside descended into utter chaos. The wailing authorities were now dangerously near, their shrill echoes ricocheting off the brick facades of 116th Street, completely obscuring their exact numbers and proximity. Falcone finally reached a resolute and chilling conclusion. Bumpy observed this silent resolution, bearing witness to that precise psychological shift when endless calculation hardened into absolute commitment. Falcone pitched his voice low enough for his remaining 3 loyalists to hear, ordering them to gather their fallen comrades and vanish through the rear exit. Utter silence filled the space, as no one dared to protest. Bumpy yielded the path, letting his rival stride toward the dark rear corridor. He paused, pivoting to lock eyes with his adversary across the shattered remains of the East 116th Street sanctuary. They stared over splintered furniture and shattered glass, breathing in the acrid stench of discharged weapons that would haunt the plaster for another 7 days. Falcone swore their brutal war remained completely unresolved. Bumpy calmly agreed, fully aware of the impending retaliation. He confessed he had anticipated the impending bloodbath from the very moment he crossed the threshold. Their fundamental divide lay in his chilling premeditation, a harsh truth that held Falcone in a tense stare for 2 agonizing heartbeats. The rival leader vanished into the shadowed corridor. His 3 surviving enforcers trailed closely behind, maintaining a swift yet fiercely disciplined retreat. The heavy metal door clanged shut, swallowing the hurried footsteps into the urban abyss. Left amidst the devastation, the solitary kingpin began a silent mental tally. 3 seconds. 5. Then 8 ticked by before he ordered an evacuation. Outside, the wailing authorities slammed into the avenue with absolute physical force. Crimson and sapphire beams pierced the frosted glass facade, washing over the devastated sanctuary in a rhythmic dance of impending doom. The blinding flashes highlighted scattered furniture and a severely splintered wooden table. The harsh glare exposed a spreading pool of crimson near the entrance before sweeping past with cold mechanical indifference. These pulsing beacons signaled an official inquiry into a shadowy nightmare that police records could never truly comprehend. The boss possessed exactly 45 precious seconds before law enforcement breached the perimeter, and he wasted nothing. Directing his focus toward the kitchen, he barked an order at his operative. This operative was 31-year-old Samuel, a veteran of the 369th Infantry Regiment. The brutal Korean conflict had taught him that surviving total chaos required flawlessly prioritizing critical objectives without ever needing a second command. The veteran sprang into immediate action. Darnell, a bartender with 19 years inside the local illicit underworld, proved equally prepared. He had sanitized far more gruesome scenes, viewing the meticulous erasure of evidence as a profound act of silent loyalty. Vaulting the counter with a previously hidden canvas sack, he methodically purged the environment with the chilling precision of a perfectly orchestrated drill. The syndicate leader approached the fallen figure stationed near the primary entrance. Kneeling beside the body, he confirmed the tragic reality. His loyal soldier had perished the exact moment he struck the hardwood. A devastatingly accurate wound behind the ear had guaranteed instantaneous death. The grieving leader maintained his kneeling posture for exactly 3 excruciating seconds. It was far too brief for true mourning, yet sufficient to pay necessary respects to the fallen. Rising abruptly, he demanded they take the corpse along. Abandoning a brother was strictly forbidden. A pair of enforcers hoisted the deceased, rushing toward the rear corridor while their commander guarded the retreat. Pausing at the dark threshold, he cast one final haunting glance over the devastated sanctuary. He observed his cleanup specialist frantically erasing the horrific sins committed during the previous 20 minutes of utter chaos. The brutal trauma stained every conceivable surface, leaving the atmosphere saturated with a palpable terror, much like ancient timber absorbing a bitter winter storm. Plunging into the corridor shadows, he reached a heavy exterior door. This hidden threshold spilled into a claustrophobic service passage running entirely parallel to 116th Street. This clandestine escape route remained entirely concealed between adjacent structures, rendering it completely invisible to any ordinary pedestrian passing by. The designated getaway vehicle had vanished from its original parking spot 2 blocks east. Instead, it idled menacingly in the alleyway, a direct result of a single discreet phone call placed from the kitchen amidst the earlier tension. This brilliant tactical contingency was established long before the gathering commenced. Consequently, the syndicate vanished into the night before a single patrolman breached the main entrance. Decades later, judicial records from an entirely separate prosecution would casually summarize the horrific bloodshed of that evening. The official legal transcript coldly dismissed the massacre as an altercation of mysterious genesis involving completely unidentified participants. This chillingly vague phrasing captured the exact essence of 1951 Harlem perfectly. Meanwhile, Detective Raymond Cole officially breached the perimeter at exactly 12:31 in the morning. At 44 years of age, the grizzled investigator boasted 18 years of brutal street experience. policing the northern boundaries of this notorious criminal empire. Warring factions across the neighborhood recognized his true corrupt nature. They understood completely that this particular municipal employee padded his official paycheck with illicit funds entirely concealed from his oblivious superiors. Stepping beyond the main entrance, he silently surveyed the chaotic interior. Remaining utterly motionless, he soon commanded the patrolmen behind him to establish a strict lockdown. He demanded total lockdown, prompting the subordinate to retreat outdoors while he began a deliberate patrol. His gaze drifted toward the entryway tiles before fixating upon the violently upended furniture. He scrutinized the ruined counter, noting subtle traces of concealed criminal activity visible only to a seasoned investigator intimately familiar with such macabre aftermaths. Such environments were always sanitized by phantoms before official badges intervened. After silently jotting an observation into his standard pad, he drifted toward the rear corridor to inspect the back departure point. The heavy wooden door rested slightly open as freezing autumn gusts aggressively swept through the narrow gap. A patrolman materialized at the main entrance to announce the discovery of a willing observer. A female resident occupying the opposite structure claimed she witnessed unidentified individuals fleeing the establishment approximately 20 minutes prior. The investigator demanded a head count, but the subordinate blamed the darkness for masking their identities entirely. The detective acknowledged her uncertainty with a grim nod, ordering his subordinate to extract a highly detailed and unhurried testimony. Once the patrolman retreated outdoors, the investigator lingered in the desolate rear corridor before extracting a distinctly separate ledger from his coat. This tiny, weathered hide journal served as the true repository for his most secretive scribbled observations. He concealed the illicit item, navigated the demolished interior, and emerged onto the chaotic pavement of 116th Street. Flashing emergency strobes painted the avenue as neighborhood residents congregated near the intersection, entirely unfazed by the freezing nocturnal chill. This restless neighborhood possessed an uncanny instinct for sniffing out genuine nocturnal tragedies. Instinct preceded facts as silent stares were exchanged between the cynical detective and the mute civilian audience until 1:15 in the morning. The bloody environment underwent a highly selective contamination masked as an official forensic investigation. Corrupt investigators ensured 3 spent cartridges officially entered the evidentiary chain, while purposely ignoring numerous others scattered across the floorboards. Critical identities discovered within a ledger near the counter migrated swiftly into the personal journal of the detective before official cataloging occurred. 7:40 arrived. The local newspaper acquired a remarkably vague police dispatch regarding an ambiguous gunfight on East 116th Street that conveniently lacked confirmed casualties. This masterclass in bureaucratic deception utilized technically truthful phrasing to completely obscure the sheer magnitude of the massacre. 2 competing publications foolishly regurgitated this identical sanitized narrative by 9 in the morning. By 10 in the morning, local residents completely disregarded those useless publications. Whispered truths circulated fiercely through grooming parlors, holy sanctuaries, illicit gambling dens, and freezing intersections populated by huddled figures. These men braved the brutal autumn wind, trading underground intelligence to counter the painfully sterilized municipal propaganda. Genuine facts required meticulous reconstruction from shattered rumors, logical deductions, and first-hand accounts provided by surviving eyewitnesses. Information filtered through countless degrees of separation formed a terrifying narrative utterly absent from the morning broadsheets. This terrifying rumor detailed an organized underworld summit that devolved into absolute unexpected anarchy. An incredibly lethal target managed to escape a 16-weapon ambush through the rear exit, leaving utterly baffled authorities stranded at the main gates. The gossip described a meticulously scrubbed slaughterhouse and an incredibly corrupt investigator who arrived with premeditated blindness. Darkness pulsed beneath everything. An unspoken dread flowed beneath the gossip like a freezing subterranean river. A silent paranoia consumed them all, as they wondered how an infamous kingpin survived, while an entire mafia crew lost 16 soldiers in mere hours. With law enforcement discovering absolutely zero actionable evidence, the neighborhood desperately pondered the shifting underworld dynamic. The ultimate identity of their new neighborhood sovereign manifested independently of useless press conferences or municipal bulletins. Reality crystallized at dawn when the illicit couriers seamlessly launched every gambling syndicate from 110th Street to the northern overpass without delay. Everything paid out flawlessly. The illicit economy thrived identically to previous days, except no mafia enforcer demanded their customary 30% extortion fee. The taxation completely vanished as the territory operated in absolute silence under a single undisputed sovereign who casually exited a filthy alleyway at 12:29 in the morning. He vanished before the sirens arrived. A profound shift settled over the neighborhood at dawn. An unspoken truth felt deeply in the bones, rather than read in any morning editions. A brief column hidden deep within the Daily Gazette vaguely hinted at a commotion, carefully omitting any identifying markers or concrete facts. Yet the community never relied on printed ink for reality. The asphalt whispered its own undeniable facts, painting an incredibly vivid picture of impending conflict. By 6 in the morning, every syndicate-affiliated collection hub between 112th and 120th had vanished completely, leaving absolutely nothing behind. Makeshift desks vanished, and identifying symbols were erased, obliterating all memory of the enterprises. The local wager couriers operated with an intense urgency, gathering their resources swiftly and constantly staying out of reach from any prying interrogations. The underworld boss had completely skipped resting. He occupied a secure kitchen along St. Nicholas Avenue, a completely untraceable location utterly detached from his identity, sipping bitter brew while profoundly contemplating the rival boss's impending tactical maneuvers. The realization proved remarkably simple. Any adversary brazenly entering a gathering flanked by 16 armed enforcers, only to flee through the rear exit, faced profound consequences. Escaping amidst wailing authority, alarms inflicted psychological damage vastly exceeding a mere collapsed agreement. That rival endured profound degradation before his loyalists, and ruthless syndicates never swallowed such bitter shame peacefully. They inevitably retaliated with extreme prejudice. The adversaries will strike 3 separate coordinates concurrently. The boss informed his trusted lieutenant upon reviewing the early intelligence briefing. The Lenox Enterprise, 118th Avenue drop, and 8th Avenue lending desk face incursions past midnight, drawing his lieutenant's deep stare. "We must retreat immediately. We never surrender our ground to anyone," the resolute kingpin firmly declared. Retreating surrenders the entire domain before the adversaries even march forward. So instead, we must completely alter the reception they encounter upon arrival. By 10 in the morning, he inspected 11 establishments between 110th and 125th. Every exchange within those salons and diners remained notably brief. "Significant conflict will erupt within 36 hours, he warned, an established dining proprietor, operating locally since 1923. "Ensure your establishment remains welcoming throughout daylight hours. Lock your staff indoors past 8, and if authorities demand testimony, maintain absolute blindness." The proprietor offered a deeply resigned gaze typical of resilient veterans confronting grim inevitabilities. "Will the carnage be severe?" "It will simply conclude definitively," the underworld leader replied. "That definitive conclusion remains paramount. Subsequent harrowing events survive, almost exclusively through whispered generational folklore. Official police archives regarding this tumultuous era remain remarkably barren, leaving modern investigators navigating massive voids within verified historical documentation. When midday struck, 11 local proprietors had firmly established their allegiances. This decision stemmed not from sheer bravery, but from a chilling realization that attempting impartiality during such crises invited devastating repercussions, enduring far beyond immediate bloodshed. They embraced their community, inherently backing the reigning neighborhood sovereign. 3 in the afternoon triggered a massive shift. Every single junction from 110th to the bridge abruptly ceased funneling resources toward rival syndicate intermediaries. This sudden rebellion occurred entirely without central mandates. Instead, pavement operators synthesized raw survival instincts with mounting whispers of impending doom, independently calculating an identical grim reality. The neighborhood's hierarchy had permanently shifted. Approaching 6 in the evening, the Kingpin returned to St. Nicholas, organizing tactical deployments alongside his lieutenant. Their scribbled parchment outlined 3 battlegrounds, 12 loyalists, and 4 escape routes. "The adversaries strike past midnight," he murmured. "We absolutely refuse to passively await their arrival at our strongholds. We shall violently intercept their approach through the shadowy transit corridors." A strategic strike beforehand, he hesitated. Grasp the critical distinction? His lieutenant comprehended. This separated defensive survival from utter annihilation. Darkness descended upon the urban labyrinth like a suffocating burial shroud, concealed beneath its oppressive weight. Shadows occupied forgotten stoops, narrow passages, and idle vehicles across 12 sprawling avenues. Hardened enforcers claimed their tactical vantage points, exhibiting the chilling composure of predators who possessed absolute foreknowledge of their prey's exact itinerary. 36 hours post-collapse along East 116th, the district collectively choked back its anxiety. The suffocating silence suddenly shattered. 3 locations and 3 death squads converged at midnight. The adversaries possessed a formidable strategy. Apply synchronized strangulation and deploy crushing momentum before isolated defensive factions could circulate warnings. This identical synchronized brutality previously secured victories for the infamous syndicate throughout foreign districts, boasting vastly more conventional hierarchies of authority. Yet this sovereign territory completely defied conventional underworld expectations. The rival vanguard marched onto 118th Avenue exactly 7 minutes past midnight, featuring 7 heavily armed operatives strutting with the arrogant swagger of absolute predators. Chins raised and steel easily retrievable, their arrogant postures practically screamed unshakable faith in their tactical assault. They penetrated barely 40 paces down the shadowy corridor. The ensuing bloodbath concluded within 11 agonizing heartbeats. 4 invaders violently collapsed, while 2 panicked survivors scrambled wildly northward. The final intruder instantly collapsed upon his kneecaps, thrusting empty palms skyward, securing his temporary survival. The defending faction sustained a singular minor flesh wound. Crimson spilled superficially. Simultaneously, the secondary combat theater yielded identical slaughter within a mirrored time frame. That tertiary strike zone harbored the rival architect himself, lingering cowardly outside the immediate crossfire within an idling vehicle securely parked down an adjoining alleyway. Such cowardly staging perfectly reflected traditional syndicate protocol. Sovereigns orchestrate carnage afar, avoiding personal bloodshed, a cowardly tactic the neighborhood monarch had precisely predicted. Approaching the vehicle personally, he tapped against the glass with the casual familiarity of a routine neighborhood visit. His movements remained chillingly unhurried. As the window lowered, the chauffeur hovered his fingers over a concealed firearm, freezing entirely upon recognizing the shadow looming on the pavement. The bodyguard paralyzed his grip instantly. In the rear, Falcone required 3 agonizing seconds to process the terrifying reality materializing before his very eyes. Bumpy coldly studied the realization, watching pure denial mutate into desperate calculation. Finally, a profound paralysis took over, characteristic of a cornered predator accepting his inevitable defeat. Without hesitation, Bumpy pulled the back door open and entered the vehicle. Settling next to Falcone, he kept his gun hidden and his tone muted, weaponizing an absolute silence for 30 agonizing seconds. Beyond the glass, 116th Street kept its dark rhythm, completely oblivious to the terror unfolding inside. "The matter stands resolved," Bumpy murmured. Falcone kept his fingers tightly clasped, projecting the terrifying stiffness of forced emotional restraint. 3 separate targets, the mobster whispered. "Impossible. I have ruled this neighborhood for 23 years, Bumpy replied softly. "While you spent barely 2 attempting an invasion." You arrived armed with manpower, endless funds, and grand strategies. Such tactics only succeed against victims remaining completely oblivious to your impending arrival. He let the heavy truth settle. I anticipated your strike before you ever conceived it. Falcone merely stared blankly into the dark distance. Our prior summit avoided bargaining, acting simply as an exchange of words, Bumpy explained. Dialogues yield intelligence, and true intelligence easily outvalues a 30% cut of any operation. Legends of this midnight confrontation have endlessly circulated throughout the neighborhood's oral history. These passed-down narratives must be recognized as living myths, bearing foundational truths in their marrow, even when precise historical specifics drift over countless decades. Name your terms. Falcone delivered a sincere inquiry, completely abandoning any strategic bargaining offers. I require absolutely zero from your operation, Bumpy declared coldly. Retreat to the lower districts immediately. Inform your powerful superiors that this community maintains its traditional operational structure, and this historical ecosystem permanently forbids any outside interference whatsoever. Powerful figures operate above my authority, Falcone warned cautiously. These superiors hold deep stakes in this final outcome. Then initiate that discussion, Bumpy commanded. Report the brutal truths you absorbed this evening. He pushed the door open. Freezing autumn wind flooded the cabin, dragging in the raw scent of asphalt and urban darkness. It represented a metropolis that relentlessly grinds forward, indifferent to the secret tragedies unfolding within isolated vehicles along shadowy avenues. This domain is neither a market, a conquerable territory, nor a mathematical percentage. It governs its own fate. Stepping onto the pavement, he monitored the sedan as it sluggishly departed toward the lower city limits. Pivoting northward, he vanished into the neighborhood. Before 4 in the morning, the avenues were entirely scrubbed clean. Approaching 6 o'clock, the boulevards assumed their usual deceptive normalcy. Absolutely nobody admitted involvement in the night's carnage, maintaining a permanent, unbreakable silence. Dawn brought a freezing, colorless gloom. The atmosphere lacked any cathartic resolution or cinematic sunbeams piercing the heavy overcast skies. A suffocating autumn heaviness merely crushed down upon concrete structures, maintaining an identical stoic facade reflecting both their past and future states. The community expertly maintained a deceptive external normalcy, entirely concealing the violent, permanent transformation of its hidden internal power dynamics. His lieutenant arrived past dawn, delivering black coffee and a concise briefing. Every operation targeted during the midnight raid resumed full functionality before 7 in the morning. Street enforcers reclaimed their posts, executing taxation schedules with brutal punctuality. Meanwhile, the rival syndicate's compromised outposts remained completely severed and dead. The 30% tribute debate was entirely terminated. That captive from 118th Street? Bumpy asked. Liberated under darkness, Samuel confirmed. He retreated on foot. Sparing him was a calculated psychological maneuver. Executing a foot soldier provokes retaliation, whereas freeing one broadcasts a chilling reality. We held the power to destroy you, yet consciously refrained. This action broadcasted a profound truth impossible to verbalize. It signaled pure dominance. He wielded a chilling, unyielding authority, driven not by fiery vengeance, but through a calculated comprehension of violent cause and effect. Marcus's dependents are secure now, the boss murmured. During the previous night, he remained chillingly silent. Beyond the window pane, a young boy halted on the concrete, inspecting discarded street debris with that profound, consuming fascination possessed only by youth, staring deeply at tragic artifacts that mature minds instinctively ignore. The crime lord observed the youth momentarily, before silently draining his dark brew. A comprehensive historical record detailing those bloody 48 hours remains entirely absent from official police archives. The terrifying truth survives only in fragmented flashbacks of deceased mobsters, manifesting through the grim legacy they left behind. During the subsequent month, 3 highly suspicious developments rapidly unfolded. Carmine Falcone suffered exile into a minor New Jersey racket, officially labeled a standard managerial rotation. This cover story fooled nobody aware of the encounter on East 116th Street. Investigator Raymond Cole abruptly resigned that November at 44 years of age, blaming fabricated medical conditions. He subsequently relocated into a lavish Queens estate, valued vastly beyond the financial boundaries of an honest municipal pension. Rico Alvarez completely evaporated. His vacant residence and severed networks were left abandoned without explanation. The community understood the severe danger of probing into these mysterious vanishings. Consequently, the local criminal underworld began functioning with a brutal, unprecedented transparency. It possessed not genuine peace, but rather absolute, terrifying discipline. A chilling structural harmony emerged, born only when a solitary kingpin achieves undisputed supremacy, violently settling the dispute over geographical ownership so definitively that nobody ever dares to whisper a challenge again. The bloody incidents of late October 1951 never saw the inside of a courtroom. Authorities convened no grand juries for the dead, as police dossiers gathered dust in forgotten precinct vaults before vanishing entirely. By the 1960s, those very documents mysteriously evaporated into the ether, purged by unseen specters who left no bureaucratic fingerprints behind. The institutional record of those brutal 48 hours remains utterly hollow, while the terrifying truth survived only within the soul of the community itself. The authentic narrative festered in the ominously quiet avenues, among the illicit corner hustles, and behind the frightened eyes of silent merchants. You could feel the aftermath in the eerie calmness that washed over the neighborhood sidewalks throughout the ensuing months. The community radiated a dark, newfound swagger, having brutally answered a lingering existential threat. Toward the freezing end of November, a humble cafe proprietor intercepted the legendary kingpin along the pavement of 121st Street. The merchant whispered about outsiders who arrogantly believed they could conquer their streets, treating their home like an empty conquest, prompting a chilling stare from the boss. He quietly explained that their territory was indeed mere geography, but the fiercely loyal souls inhabiting it could never be conquered or swapped. The patriarch continued his stroll into the biting autumn wind, his rhythmic strides betraying absolutely no panic nor hesitation. He appeared as nothing more than an ordinary citizen surveying his kingdom on a remarkably mundane morning. By December 1951, his terrifying reputation dominated the underground without ever appearing in print, requiring zero introduction from the northern parks down to the southern bridges. His phantom authority bled into the very brickwork, forging the psychological armor of a community that survived a devastating siege. The Godfather patrolled his concrete empire daily, finding his territory exactly as undisturbed as he left it, while the neighborhood silently pardoned the autumn bloodshed. No judge ever slammed a heavy wooden gavel. The justice system produced zero convictions, erasing the entire bloodbath from the annals of legal history. The battered plaster of that ill-fated parlor on East 116th Street swallowed the acrid cordite smoke, guarding the grim massacre with absolute, unyielding silence. The ruthless mastermind survived for 17 additional orbits around the sun following that massacre, ruling the asphalt until his failing mortal vessel surrendered. Throughout those remaining decades, absolutely no rival dared demand a 30% tribute again, proving that the most profound conquests remain undocumented. True dominance is simply endured and survived. And should this chilling plunge into history captivate your mind, join our channel to witness the multitude of grim mysteries we will unearth next. We deeply appreciate your presence as we conclude this dark narrative, leaving us to wonder if this man operated as a brutal sociopath or served as the sole bastion of justice his community possessed. Imagine yourself suffocating in the tension of that fateful parlor when the ultimate ultimatum fell upon the timber. Would you have surrendered to the terrifying shadows, or chosen to unleash ungodly violence?